Welcome to C.S. Lewis and the Postmodern Generation. His message 50 years later by Alister, McGrath. The second Lanier Theological Library presentation at LCU. I am Jesse Long, Dean of the College of Biblical Studies and Behavioral Sciences. We have had again an overwhelming response from the Lubbock community for an academic lecture. Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping make this Lanier event a singular event, this Lanier lecture. Dr. Ken Jones, Chancellor of LCU, will now extend further words of welcome and introduce our special guest, Mark Lanier.
Well, it's quite a privilege to be able to join with Dr. Long in giving a welcome to each of you tonight. We're so thrilled that you're here for this very, very special event. We're thrilled to have you here in the McDonald Moody Auditorium here on the campus of Lubbock Christian University. And it's my honor tonight to be able to have this little small part on the program whereby I introduce our sponsor, I guess, of the evening. Mark Lanier and his wife Becky have made this special event possible, along with their Lanier Theological Library. And if I did a proper introduction of Mark Lanier, it would take all of their time tonight. I mean, I looked at some materials that kind of talk about Mark, and they're just vast materials. But I'll start like this. Yes, he is a native of Lubbock, Texas. And yes, he is a graduate of the Texas Tech School of Law. And yes, he is one of the top, if not the top, trial attorneys in the United States. Now, that's not a debatable assessment on my part. That's really kind of documented by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Texas Monthly Magazine, and the list of things that cite his expertise in the trial or courtroom. Just amazing what he's done. I'm not sure how anyone, Mark, could attain more than what you've attained in the legal profession. But that's not what interests me so much tonight. I have long decided that what's in a person's heart is more important than the title that they bear. And a long time ago, I decided what's in a person's heart's more important than what they accomplished with their lives. And I want you to know tonight that Mark Lanier has a very, very special heart. He has a heart for people, he has a heart for ministry, and he has a heart for our God. I get his outlines for his Sunday morning Bible class at the Champions Forest Baptist Church. Have listened to him there on more than one occasion. And some of his outlines are 20 pages. I'm talking about manuscript style outline. So he is a Bible scholar, in my opinion. He knows the Hebrew language and the Greek language, and he just has this enormous heart for our God and for ministry of people. And Mark, we are so thrilled that you're on the campus of Lubbock Christian University. We're so thrilled that you're our friend here. And ladies and gentlemen, will you help me welcome Mr. Mark Lanier?
Oh, he is way too kind. I've got a lot of friends out there, and it's always an honor for me to get to come home. And so thank you guys for coming to hear tonight. My favorite theologian in the world. I don't count my preacher as a theologian, David, so you're okay. My favorite theologian in the world. I first met Professor McGrath indirectly. Our son had returned from Oxford, where he got his master's, and I think at the time had been studying for his master's there. And he said to me, Dad, you love to read theology. How much McGrath have you read? And I said, well, I've got several of his books, but I haven't spent much time in them. And he said, well, everybody who's anybody who loves the Lord at Oxford reads everything Alister McGrath ever wrote. I said, ask me again next time you come home. And I set myself to reading everything I could. Amazing. Amazing works of theology, amazing works of church history, amazing works of science. And this is a gentleman, you've got his credentials on the handout you received, the program when you came in on the back side. It will tell you that he holds degrees in sciences as well as in theology. But what amazed me was how I got to know him beyond that. I decided I'd like this man to come lecture at our library in Houston. So I managed to ferret an email address out for him. And I sent him an email and established a relationship over several emails. And then really worked hard to put together that perfect email saying, would you come to Houston? And his reply was very gracious and very polite. No. He said he had very limited miles left on his body, and he planned on using them as much as possible for areas where the church was undeveloped. I found out then that this is a man who, as an ordained minister, goes out into community churches in the Cotswolds that don't have a preacher and will preach in these little communities of 50 and 60 people, even though he's a world-renowned theologian. And that's where his heart is. So recognizing we weren't going to get him, I co-opted time before him in England so that I could put the hard sell on in person. And our son was rowing in the summer eights at Oxford. I think at this point maybe he was already working on his DPhil there. And I asked Professor McGrath if I could have 30 minutes of his time. And he had one small window open. And it required me to get from the boat race that ostensibly I was over there to see to him in a matter of 5 minutes. And I had to be there at the finish line for my son. And yet I could not stand up Professor McGrath, and I had a limited window with him. So I ran as fast as I could and got there 10 minutes late to see Professor McGrath, thinking he had left. He had not. He was there. He was kind. He was gracious. And I realized that this man of incredible breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge, this man who's able to take his energy and corral it into more publications than most of us will read in our lifetime, has a heart not only for God, but has the fruit of the Spirit of God. It didn't take long before I convinced him to come to Houston and give a lecture. He came. It was such a well-received lecture. I'm driving him back to the airport. And I said, so what are you working on now? And he said, well, I think I'm going to do a C.S. Lewis book for his 50th anniversary, which was at the time, I think, a year or two away, 2 years away, I think. And I said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, I've lined up, or maybe he said, I'm going to line up. But I'm gathering together all of the resources on Lewis. I want everything the man wrote from A to Z. I want it, every address he gave, every letter I can access, every book, everything from the man, from the time he was starting to write till the day he died. And I'm going to put it in chronological order and read it. Then I'm going to write. I nearly had a wreck. And not because of anything other than euphoria. I said, as a lawyer, that's exactly what you should do. You start at the beginning and you work and you follow it all the way through to the end. I said, I applaud you. I said, all I can say is if you do that, would you please come back to the States one more time and lecture in Houston? And he said, yes, I will. And then when I realized he really would, I said, well, could we roll Lubbock into that? Because Houston technically is just a suburb of Lubbock. He said, I don't know where Lubbock is, but if it's that close to Houston, sure. So Professor McGrath has squeezed this in somehow. He spoke at chapel this morning at Wheaton in Chicago, Illinois, and made a flight from Chicago to get here so that he could do this tonight. He's got a heart for God. He's got a mind for God. He's got a heart for man and a mind for man. and he speaks with this incredible British accent, which makes me just thrilled to give you Professor Alister McGrath.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by apologizing for that change in accent. It's a great pleasure to be here in Lubbock, and especially here in West Texas, the very first time I've been here. And it's an especial privilege to be here at this university and to talk about C.S. Lewis. And what I want to do, if I may, is talk a bit about this biography I've written, and then try and ask, why is C.S. Lewis so relevant to us today? And I'm sure there are many here tonight who know C.S. Lewis very, very well, but I hope I'll still be able to say some things to you that you'll find useful and interesting. And I guess many of you will be saying, well, look, there are quite a few works already on C.S. Lewis. So why on earth have you written yet another one? Well, I think that actually is a fair question, and I think there are a number of reasons that we could give. One of them is that there's been a massive increase in scholarship on Lewis in recent years. And I felt it would be good to try and bring what was best in this to a wider readership. And then also, I was able to work in archives in Oxford, Cambridge, in Wheaton, really beginning to look at things that related to Lewis's life and see if these cast any light on how Lewis developed or how indeed his ideas came into being. And also, I wanted to try and explain, why did Lewis become so influential? That's quite easy to do. What is not quite so easy to do is to understand why Lewis remains so influential today. This, as you all know, is 2013, 50 years after Lewis's death. I think that seemed a very natural time at which to write a biography. And I'm sure there are many here tonight whose lives have been shaped, at least to some extent, by Lewis's writings. And I'm one of them, because I used to be an atheist. I have to say I was quite an aggressive atheist as a young man, and I sometimes, when I read the writings of Richard Dawkins, I feel all nostalgic, because that's the way I used to be. But happily, I have moved on. But when I became a Christian in my first year at Oxford University, I found myself wanting to engage with somebody who would help me think through my faith. And someone said, look, you ought to read this guy, C.S. Lewis. He used to be an atheist. He became a Christian. He might have some good things to say to you. And I did. And 40 plus years later, I'm still reading him and getting stuff out of him. And indeed, that's really one of the things I think I can do in this biography. I write as an enthusiast. I also write as an Irishman and somebody who knows Oxford well. And Lewis, I think, many of you will think of as an English writer, but really, he's Irish. And trying to get that side of him right, I think, is very important. So many of you will be saying, but I'm sure you're so polite you won't say it out loud. Well, you know, this is all very well, but why you? Why are you writing a biography about C.S. Lewis? And I think that is fair. And I think I want to begin by saying, look, I've been reading Lewis a long time. I've got to know his writings, and I really respect him. But secondly, this Irish side of things is important, because Lewis kept going back to Ireland every year for his vacations. In his later writings, he talks about himself as an Irishman, and that side of things, I think, is quite important. Both Lewis and I grew up in Belfast. But more than that, both Lewis and I went from Belfast to Oxford University. We were both undergraduates, we became Oxford Dons, and both of us had this sense of being outsiders. An Irishman in England is always slightly on the margins, and certainly both of us felt that. But more importantly, both of us began as atheists and discovered Christianity while we were at Oxford. And of course, one of my interests is intellectual history, and that meant I understood a lot about Lewis's background, some of the ideas and writers he wrestled with. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense to write this biography. So how did I do this? Well, as Mark Lanier was mentioning, the key thing was to read everything Lewis wrote in chronological order. And that was a labor of love. It took me 15 months, but it was really wonderful because it enabled me to look at Lewis's development of his ideas, see how his style changed, and also moving on then to look at the very large secondary literature on Lewis. And of course, archive work kind of filled in some of the details, and I'll touch on some of that in a moment. And I think it's right to ask, well, okay, it's a new biography. What is actually new about it? Because there's no point in simply reprising what everybody else has said before. So I want to talk to you just about a few things that are in the biography to help you understand where it moves things ahead. There are two main things, as you would expect. First of all, there are some new things I uncovered. I think they help us to understand more about Lewis, and I'll tell you about two of those in a moment. And secondly, there are a lot of things that we already knew about Lewis, and I suggest we can see them in a slightly different way. In other words, it's not so much new evidence, it's new interpretations. And so again, I'll talk about that in a moment. Let's begin by looking at some new evidence. One of the things I came across was a hitherto unknown letter from Lewis to the Swedish Academy in January 1961, proposing Tolkien for the 1961 Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, why is that important? Well, as you probably know, Lewis and Tolkien became very close friends in the 1920s and 1930s. Lewis helped Tolkien write The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien helped Lewis get some of the ideas for Narnia. So the two really had a very good relationship, which encouraged and stimulated each other to write. But in the 1940s and 1950s, the relationship began to fall to pieces. Tolkien felt that Lewis was not really paying enough attention. He felt that Lewis had excluded him from his company, and the relationship went wrong. The fact that Lewis proposed Tolkien for the Nobel Prize just 2 years before his death, I think brings home that Lewis retained affection and respect for Tolkien, even though they were alienated. And I may add, there is no evidence at all that Tolkien ever knew that Lewis had done this. So that just casts a chink of light on Tolkien himself. Then there are documents that help us understand aspects of Lewis's career. I'm going to mention just one very small example. Lewis went to war in 1971. He joined the British Army. In fact, more specifically, he joined the Somerset Light Infantry. And most biographies say, well, Lewis joined the Somerset Light Infantry and went to war. But I kind of stopped there and thought, why on earth did he join the Somerset Light Infantry? Now, Somerset is a lovely English county. I have nothing against it. But there was no connection between Lewis and Somerset at all. He could have joined an Irish regiment. He could have joined the local Oxford regiment, or the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Here is what I think happened. While Lewis was training for the army in Oxford, he roomed with Paddy Moore, a young man his own age who had moved to Oxford with his mother and his sister. And Paddy Moore and Lewis became best friends. And this kind of relationship very often developed where two young men were going off to war. They were unlikely both to come back alive, and very often very close friendships would result. So Paddy Moore was Lewis's best friend, and we know that Paddy Moore ended up in the Rifle Brigade. He died on the Somme in March 1918. But here is a clue. This is a section of a document never seen before. It is the, in effect, day-to-day orders of the officer training unit in which Paddy Moore and C.S. Lewis served. What I want you to notice is the third name down. Paddy Moore, given by his full name, Moore, EMC. Notice the initials at the right-hand side. That is the sponsoring Regiment. SOMLI is Somerset Light Infantry. It looks as if Lewis asked to join that regiment because his best friend expected to be posted to it. In the end, Paddy Moore was sent somewhere else, and Lewis went into battle without any close friends at all. So what about new interpretations? Well, there's one, I think, that does rather stand out. And this is controversial, but I'm going to tell you what it is so you know. It's the date when Lewis began to believe again in God. And Lewis had been an atheist for a long time, and in a very dramatic and exciting development, he began to reconnect with God and talks about being the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. And his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, dates this very precisely to Trinity Term 1929, in other words, to an 8-week period between the 28th of April and the 22nd of June 1929. My argument is that the evidence points to this actually happening a year later. Why? Well, I think first of all, we need to look at the evidence about Lewis's father's death. Lewis's father died in September 1929. Lewis's mother died back in 1908. There was just Lewis, his brother, and his father left. But when you read Lewis's letters from this time, there is no mention of God at all in Lewis's reflections on his father's illness or his death. And I found that strange. And I began to wonder, maybe Lewis's father's death was a stimulus to thinking about God rather than something Lewis interpreted in the light of an existing belief in God. Then secondly, I mentioned I read everything Lewis wrote in chronological order. And there's a distinct change in tone or mood in Lewis's letters for the summer of 1930. There's nothing in 1929. And it's clear that something, whatever it is, has happened in 1930. And then Lewis, I'm afraid, was hopeless about dates. He got very, very muddled. His brother said he'd got a lifelong inability to remember dates. And in 1941, Lewis was made the vice president of Magdalen College. That was a rather honorary position, and its duty was booking rooms for meetings. And I have to say to you that it soon became clear that rooms were not being booked or they were being double booked. And in effect, Lewis very gladly gave up that responsibility. So it indicates dates are not his strong point. But this is really interesting. One of Lewis's closest friends was Owen Barfield. And in February 1930, Lewis writes to Barfield using language that parallels Lewis's description of his conversion in Surprised by Joy. There's the letter. Terrible things are happening to me. The spirit or real I is showing an alarming tendency to become much more personal. It's taking the offense of behaving just like God. You better come by Monday to latest, or I may have entered the monastery. Now, that doesn't make much sense if Lewis already believes in God. It makes a lot of sense if Lewis is on the brink of discovery. And Owen Barfield, later in life, pointed to that letter and said that letter marks the beginning of Lewis's conversion. So I think there are a number of issues here. One final point I think is very important. Lewis tells us that even though by this stage he was not yet a Christian, once he started to believe in God, he began to go to church and he started to attend his college chapel. And in October 1930, Lewis wrote to his best friend Arthur Greaves, telling him about a change in his daily routine. He says, I now go to bed earlier, and I think you can guess why he's going to bed earlier, because he started going to morning chapel at Magdalen College. That makes a lot of sense if Lewis converted in the summer of 1930. If Lewis converted a year earlier, why did he wait a year before going to chapel. So I'm saying there seems to me to be reasons to rethink. So let me look at our theme tonight. I've spoken a little bit of my biography, but I want to talk about Lewis himself. And what I want to say is that Lewis is quite remarkable. He bridges the gap between modernity and postmodernity, between a culture that focuses on argument, on words, and a different kind of culture that is more interested in stories and images. And Lewis, I think, is remarkable. He offers a rational account of faith. He shows that faith is reasonable, that faith makes sense. Yet it still embraces the world of imagination and feelings. And that's very unusual, I need to say to you. Most writers tend to be either rational or imaginative. It's quite unusual to find one who is both, and C.S. Lewis is an example. And what I want to do is focus on three themes which help us understand why Lewis relates to postmodernity so well. I'm going to look at him on reason, feeling, and imagination. Reason, I think, helps us to understand why Lewis appeals to modernity. Feeling and imagination, why he appeals to postmodernity. But all three, when they're brought together, give us a rich and fully orbed vision of the Christian faith, which all of us can take away and enjoy and benefit from. So one of the themes that lies behind Lewis's thinking on all these points is the idea of the big picture. Lewis is saying that the Christian faith is something that opens up a wonderful, compelling, attractive vision of reality. And on the screen, I've put one of his most famous quotations. It comes from the end of Lewis's essay, Is Theology Poetry? Look at it. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only do I see it, but by it, I see everything else. And it's a remarkably well-turned phrase. But look at the final part. What he is saying is the intellectual capaciousness, the ability of the Christian faith to light up the landscape of faith, even into the shadowlands. That is a mark of its truth. And that makes, I think, a lot of sense of Lewis. For example, one of the factors leading to his conversion to Christianity was his feeling that atheism was thin, was watery, presented him with a very inadequate and existentially unsatisfying understanding of reality. For Lewis, Christianity gave him a brave and bold and exciting understanding of the way things were. But he also, of course, developed a very famous argument from desire, which I'll touch on in a moment. And Lewis's argument is that we all experience a feeling of desire, of longing, of yearning for something that seems to lie beyond our grasp. And for Lewis, that really is a longing for God. And I'll talk about that again in a moment. Or indeed his famous argument from morality, which you find in the opening pages of Mere Christianity. Lewis is saying that if Christianity is right, we should expect God to intrude, God to register in our consciousness as a voice saying this is right, this is wrong, as something that gives stability to right and wrong, because otherwise it is very, very difficult to give a defense of this being right and this being wrong, other than powerful people making the decision that this is what they think is right. So let's begin to look at some very important points here. As I was saying, Lewis emphasizes that Christianity makes sense. And I think all of us value that, but it's particularly well received in the modernist part of our culture. But Lewis also has much to say about the importance of stories, the appeal to the imagination. And again, we can all benefit from that. But it appeals particularly to a more postmodern audience. And Lewis's emphasis is that Christianity is not simply something that persuades us it is right. It's something that captivates our imagination and makes us want to know more about it because we realize it is so exciting and interesting. The imagination for Lewis is a gateway for truth. So let's begin by looking at three categories: the appeal to reason, the appeal to longing, the appealing to the imagination. And we find the appeal to reason mainly in two works: Miracles and Mere Christianity. In my view, Mere Christianity is one of the best things that Lewis ever wrote. And so we're going to talk a bit about this appeal to reason in Mere Christianity. Then there's an appeal to longing, which we find especially in three writings. The difficult early book called The Pilgrim's Regress, which few people read today because it is so difficult. It repays study, but it takes time. Then there is Surprised by Joy, one of his best-known writings, which talks much about Lewis's feeling of this yearning for something and how he resolved this. And then finally, there's a sermon of 1941 called The Weight of Glory, which is only about 10 pages long, but in my view, it's a miniature masterpiece, which is a very good starting point for anybody who wants to really get their teeth into something that's very significant. So let's begin. I should have said, of course, that the appeal to the imagination is found in the Space or Ransom trilogy, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia, and also the late and I fear difficult book, Till We Have Faces. So let's look at each of these individually. Lewis and reason. Lewis opens his Mere Christianity by, in effect, saying, let's imagine people having an argument. And the issue is classic. Who's right, who's wrong? And Lewis argues that if this debate is to make any sense, if they're to avoid resorting to violence, if they're simply using intellectual arguments, then there has to be an objective standard of morality above them, which they didn't invent, which is binding on them. And Lewis then argues that both sides to the argument recognize or presuppose a law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality. And the argument is, for Lewis, that all our thinking about the universe basically boils down to the fact there is an objective moral law, not something we've invented, but something we try to express in our own thinking and in our legal thinking. And then secondly, an awareness of our failure to observe it. And Lewis will do a lot of hard work with these ideas in exploring the Christian faith. And the point that Lewis is making is that this sense that there is a moral authority above us offers us clues. Note, clues, not a proof, for the existence and nature of God. And what Lewis is saying is there are clues everywhere. Maybe individual clues are not conclusive, but when you add all these clues together, you get something that has cumulative force. It's like a legal trial, where in effect the winning party is the one that offers the best explanation of all the clues in the case. And Lewis is saying that Christianity makes sense of all the clues, including morality, our sense of longing, and lots of other things as well. And Lewis argues that we ought to realize there is something directing the universe which is over and above us, which intrudes on us and helps us realize that in our moral thinking, we're responding not so much to something within us, but something that is outside us. Now, that's very familiar, but interestingly, in his later writings in the 1950s, Lewis begins to move away from reason, not in the sense of becoming irrational, but rather he has a growing interest in other ways of thinking. And it may be that he has come to think that reason has its limits, but I think it's much more likely that his friendship with people like J.R.R. Tolkien have brought home to him that there are other ways of thinking about it. And Lewis begins to develop a new interest in human longing and the human imagination as ways of reaching out to our culture to help them grasp what Christianity is all about. So let's look at Lewis and human longing. This is not looking at the world around us, rather it's looking at the world of experience within each of us. And it's a very significant thing. There are many atheists who feel this and are unable to make sense of it. This is Bertrand Russell, a well-known atheist philosopher, talking about a feeling that there has to be something really worthwhile that he hasn't yet discovered. The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite. The beatific vision, God, I don't find it. I don't think it's to be found, but the love of it is my life. It's the spring of life within me. Now, many of you here tonight will be able to say, I know that feeling. And so will many atheists outside the church. Indeed, in Bertrand Russell's case, his daughter commented on this. She said, somewhere at the back of my father's mind, at the bottom of his heart and the depths of his soul, there was an empty space that had once been filled by God, and he never found anything else to put in it. And Lewis is addressing a feeling, an experience, which is known to many. And what I want to suggest to you is that in our postmodern culture, this is something that we can engage using Lewis as our guide. Lewis argues, for example, in Mere Christianity, especially the chapter on hope, that nothing that is created or finite can satisfy our longing. Maybe something comes along and for the time being it seems great, but we begin to realize there's still something else that we are looking for. And the argument is that for Lewis, knowing God's creatures, in other words, the world around us, makes us long to know God as their source and origin. And so Lewis's point, therefore, is that pursuing beauty, for example, the beauty of creation, cannot really be pursued because it's only going to end in frustration. Nature points beyond itself. It's a signpost, not a final destination. And it's really pointing towards God. So let's look at how Lewis develops this. He argues that within most of us, there's a sense of spiritual longing, or a sense of emptiness, such as that described by Bertrand Russell. A realization that there is a gap within us, which nothing that is created or finite can satisfy. And for Lewis, this is really a longing for God. And you may have heard the phrase, a God-shaped gap within us, often attributed to Pascal. And that's helpful because Lewis is very much moving along the same line. And in this early book, The Pilgrim's Regress, which is really Lewis's account of his own conversion, he argues that to make sense of ourselves and God, we need to realize the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given, nor can ever be imagined as given, in our present mode of subjective and spatio-temporal experience. Now, that's an early writing. You can see the style does need a bit of work, but the idea is good. What he's saying is, we come to realize that nothing really satisfies, and therefore either we must be frustrated or there is something else beyond our horizons that we have yet to find. And of course, that leads Lewis towards the whole idea of God. Now, I mentioned the sermon, The Weight of Glory, which comes, the title, from John Donne, who spoke of the exceeding weight of divine glory, preached in 1941. I want to just show you a few extracts from this, in which Lewis explores this idea with real clarity. He says, look, the books of the music in which we thought beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. In other words, we think this is beautiful, therefore we grasp this, and this ends our quest. No. If we trust to them, we'll be frustrated. It wasn't in them, it came through them. And what came through them was longing. These are signposts pointing beyond themselves, saying, not me, there. In other words, God's creation points to its creator. These things, beauty, the memory from past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they're mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. They're not the thing itself. They're only the scent of a flower we haven't found, the echo of a tune we haven't heard, news from a country we haven't visited. And Lewis there is asking us to imagine standing in the open air at night, and the fragrance of a distant flower comes to us. We're not quite sure where it is, but we know there's something there, and we wonder how we can track it back to its source and enjoy it in all its fullness. And so what Lewis is really saying is this: longing, experience, something which so many postmodern people value so much, can be used apologetically as a way of indicating the inadequacy of atheism. Think of the heart-wrenching anguish of Bertrand Russell. It's something we can talk about with our friends. And Lewis talks in the final part of The Weight of Glory of being on the wrong side of the door. Note the imagery of the door. It's one of Lewis's key images. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, he says, but all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we'll get in. So the point Lewis is making is, look, experience, when rightly interpreted, can be a clue to the existence and character of God. Sure, it's not going to be absolutely converting, but it's a way of planting seeds. It's a way of saying to people, there is more to life than you think. It's a way of getting them to say, maybe I need to start looking, to start exploring. And of course, when you read Lewis's earlier writings as an atheist, you see these ideas being explored as Lewis himself, as an atheist, begins to realize there is something which he has not yet found, but which, if he did find, was going to change his life completely. And as we all know, it did, even though we might argue about whether it did in 1929 or 1930. So we come to what I think is the most interesting aspect of Lewis, his appeal to the imagination. And Lewis talks about this even in his first work, The Pilgrim's Regress. He asks us to imagine God speaking these words to the central character of this narrative. For this end I made your senses, and for this end your imagination, that you might see my face and live. And Lewis draws a distinction. It's a very important distinction between something that is imaginary and something that is imagined. Imaginary means we make it up. Imagined means we form a mental picture of something which is somehow more deeply grounded in the way things are. And Lewis sees his job as an apologist to help us think those thoughts and see those images, which eventually are going to lead us to the living God. So I think we need to recognize that Lewis was stimulated here by two key figures. George MacDonald, the Victorian fairy tale writer, who really helped Lewis to realize how stories could captivate the imagination and smuggle in Christian ideas. And of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. And I think these are very important figures in any account of Lewis. But I'm not going to talk about how Lewis got influenced. I'm more interested in exploring what Lewis actually said and the use we can make of this. And of course, the best example of this is in Narnia. And I made Narnia central to this biography. I took the view that there would be many people who would be reading my biography who in effect would have read Narnia or seen the movies and said, who is this guy Lewis? What else did he write? How did he come to write these things? And so I try to organize the biography around the worlds that Lewis occupied, whether real or imagined. Oxford, Narnia, and Cambridge. A normal biography has difficulties here because Lewis wrote Narnia, I would argue, over a period of about 10 years. And if you do a year-by-year account, this happened in 1942, this in 1943, and so on, then Narnia gets smeared out, and it means you can't really engage with it in any detail. I found a way of, in effect, having a section on Narnia which talked about how Lewis had the ideas, how he wrote the books, and then explore with my readers this imagined world and help them to get the most out of reading it. So I think we need to ask how Lewis came to write Narnia and what we can learn from it, because it's all part of this appeal to the imagination. This is Elizabeth Anscombe towards the end of her life, and she was a philosopher who one or two of you will probably have heard of. Not all that well known, but nevertheless she played a very important role in Lewis's life. When Lewis wrote his book Miracles, it was discussed at the Socratic Club in Oxford. Remember, Lewis was president. In February 1948, Anscombe argued that Lewis's statement of his critique of naturalism, in other words, what you see is what you get, wasn't really very well stated. Now, she didn't disagree with the argument. She just said, look, it's not. You can do better than this. Can you rephrase this, expand it, so it really engages with the issues? Now, A.N. Wilson, an earlier biography of Lewis, argued that this made Lewis think that rational argument had no use. He'd been bested in argument, so he abandoned it. And he goes on to suggest that Lewis wrote Narnia because he'd ceased to believe in the power of reason. He abandoned reason, he turned to the imagination. He saw Narnia as a return to a childish world, with C.S. Lewis being like Peter Pan, a boy who never grew up. Now, I like A.N. Wilson's biography in some ways, but every now and then you have to say, I'm sorry, this just isn't right. And this is one of those cases. And the point I want to make simply, and I'll say no more, is that the evidence just doesn't support this. That Lewis saw reason and imagination as going together, enriching each other. It's not either or, they go together. And Lewis is no rationalist, if you mean by that someone who limits reality to what can be proved by reason. I want to make the point that his very famous Space Trilogy, or Ransom Trilogy, after its central character, were written well before his encounter with Anscombe. So it's not as if Lewis changed mode. He'd already explored this mode. He now saw a way of doing this more effectively. And this brings us to a central theme of Narnia and a central theme of understanding why Lewis is so important as an apologist to a postmodern generation. And I'm talking here about retelling the grand narrative. What do I mean by grand narrative? I mean the story that lies at the heart of the Christian faith. The story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. The story that lies behind the Narnia Chronicles. And Lewis was very sensitive, very alert to the importance of stories in shaping our understanding of reality and understanding our own place within it. And Lewis realized that one of the key themes in any person's life is saying, how does my story link up with a bigger story? How am I part of a bigger scheme of things? And his argument is that once we see this bigger story, we're able to see our own little story in a new and more meaningful way and work out where we fit into this bigger reading of things. And Lewis argues that once we begin to grasp this bigger story, we can begin to figure out the difference that each of us can make and where God wants us to be. So let's go to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In my view, the best of the Narnia Chronicles, and in my view also the one you should read first in the series. And what I want you to do is remember what happens when the 4 children enter Narnia. They hear stories about this strange place, where it came from, whose it is, and so on. And they have to ask a very difficult question. Which of these stories is right? Which is to be trusted? Is Narnia really the realm of the White Witch who justly and rightly rules? Or is she a usurper whose power will be broken when the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve sit on the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel? Is Narnia really the realm of this mysterious Aslan, whose return is expected at any time? And they have to ask, which of these stories do I trust? And of course, as you know, one story begins to emerge as supremely plausible, the story of Aslan, the noble lion of Narnia. And as you read the whole series of these books, each individual story of Narnia turns out to be part of this greater narrative. So if you like, going back to the point I made at the beginning, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe hints at this big picture, which we find in the Narnia series. And once the right story is identified, it helps us to make sense of what is going on in Narnia. When Lucy reads the book of the stories, she begins to realize exactly what's going on. Now, why is this important? Well, I think it's a first point to make, really, is that Lewis is retelling, in his own distinctive way, the grand story of the Christian faith. He's not inventing a story at all. He's taking the Christian story and retelling it in a way that intrigues us, that draws us in, that helps us to see things which otherwise we wouldn't see at all. In other words, Lewis is using Narnia as a way of helping us to enter into the best and biggest and most trustworthy story of all, which is the story that lies at the heart of the Christian faith, in which a good and beautiful creation is spoiled and ruined by a fall, in which the Creator's power is denied and usurped, but the Creator then enters the creation to break the power of the usurper and restore things through redemptive sacrifice. And here's the important point, and this, I think, is really significant in understanding why Narnia appeals to so many people. Even after Aslan comes, the struggle against sin and evil continues, and it won't be ended until a final restoration and transformation of all things. In other words, Lewis is helping us to see that even though Christ has come, we live in a world that is not yet the kingdom of God, in which we have to make choices, we have to live by faith, we have to become virtuous people. And the story of each character in the Narnia Chronicles is a story of someone who tries to make sense of things, to identify their place in the story, and then do their job well. It's a way of articulating what the Christian faith is all about. Now, here's another point that's really important. In our culture, we also hear different stories. Some would say we simply come to be here by accident. There is no purpose to life. It doesn't matter what you do. What you see is what you get, and death marks the end. That's one story. It's a story the media pick up on, but there's another story alongside it, which is that each of us is meant to be here, that each of us is precious and important to God, that we are meant to be doing something which can change things and make a difference. And like the children in Narnia, we're being asked, which story do we trust, and what difference does that make to us? If I could put it very, very crudely, modernity is asking, is this true? Postmodernity is asking, is this real? How does this bear on real life? And now Lewis is answering both of those questions. The Christian faith is true, but it also gives us a vision for who we are, why we matter, and what we are meant to be doing. So there's a lot we could say. There's a quote from G.K. Chesterton, which lies at the heart of a lot of what Lewis is saying. Every true artist feels he is touching transcendental truths, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. And what Lewis tries to do in Narnia, in Miracles, in Mere Christianity, is see beyond the limits of this world, to get a glimpse of something beyond it. And one day we will be there. But in the meantime, we journey by faith and not by sight. So Lewis really helps us to step inside the Christian story and to help us realize how it makes so much sense of things and helps us work out what we should be doing. And it resonates very, very strongly with a shift in our cultural mood, which gives a new importance to image and, of course, means stories are perhaps today more powerful as an apologetic tool than arguments. And so you might say that in the past we've used images, that now, in many ways, we're moving to look at stories instead. And you might like to look at some of these incidents. You might think of Harry Potter, of Philip Pullman. These are stories that are being told to captivate the imagination and to smuggle in ideas and values. Perhaps not Christian, perhaps anti-Christian. Lewis realized his stories were able to get Christian ideas across to his readers. I want to say he's right in recognizing the importance of this and that we need more people like Lewis to tell stories in this way. So Narnia, I think, is very, very important. And what I want to do in ending this lecture is just to give you a case study in how we might apply Lewis in this postmodern context. And what I'm going to do is look at a standard objection to Christianity. And many of you will have heard this before. It's this. You just believe in God because you need to. You've invented God to meet your needs. Now, there are several ways of answering this. I'm going to give the way I would answer it, which is worthy, but unfortunately a little dull. And then I'm going to give you Lewis's approach and let you see the difference, okay? My way. What I would do is to say, look, this is where this is coming from. I say it began in the 1830s. It got some very obvious weaknesses. I would make the point, its basic idea is that God is some kind of projection of human longings. There isn't a God, so we invent one. We want there to be a God, so we invent a God. And I would make the point that that is found in Sigmund Freud's idea of God as a wish fulfillment. And I would make some points. I would say, look, things just don't exist because we want them to. For example, my throat is going very dry, and I want some water, but oh my goodness, look. You know, whether I want something or not has no bearing on whether it's there or not. We might all wish there was a couple of $1 million here, and we can wish all we want, but I don't think it's going to happen. But the point I want to make in a minute is simply this. This is also true of atheism. Why are people atheists? Very often, it's because they want there to be no God. I want to be able to do whatever I like. I want to be completely free. I want to be unrestrained. Therefore, I'm an atheist because I ditch God, and that makes life a lot easier. So I'd say, look, the argument really isn't all that persuasive. But Lewis is different. Lewis would tell a story to make his point. He'd let us use our imaginations to see that a point that seemed quite reasonable actually isn't so at all. And so we're going to look at The Silver Chair, one of the later Narnia books, which is set in a dark underground world ruled by a witch. Those of you who are interested, this is a reworking of the image of Plato's cave. And what Lewis does is to imagine a confrontation in this underground kingdom between the witch who rules it and a Narnian prince. The prince is trying to say, look, you live in this underground world, but there's a much better world beyond it. You know, the real world, what he calls the overworld. Now, let's look at how this goes. The prince uses an analogy. He says, look, the world I know, there's a sun in the sky. And he begins to explain what the sun is like. You see that lamp, this is the Narnian prince saying. It is a round and yellow, gives light to the whole room. It hangeth from the roof. Now that thing we call the sun is like the lamp, only far greater and brighter. It gives light to the whole overworld and hangeth in the sky. The witch replies very quickly and with great sophistication. Hangeth from what, my lord? Asked the witch. And while they were all working out how to answer, she added, you see, when you try to think out clearly what the sun must be, you can't tell me. You can only tell me it's like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there is nothing in the dream that wasn't copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. In other words, they've just invented it. Now, as you heard those words read to you, you will see that Lewis's story subverts the witch's argument. It says, look, you know, it sounds sophisticated, but we all know there really is a sun, don't we? So that sounded sophisticated, but it's simply not right. And the point I want to make is that Lewis asks us to use our imaginations in not simply appreciating the riches of the Christian faith, but also in critiquing other ways of looking. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot more I could have said, as you will have gathered, but I think I really must bring this lecture to an end. And I want to do so simply by saying one thing which I hope you'll find useful. Every biographer gets to know the subject of the biography very well. A friend of mine began a biography a few years back and abandoned it halfway through because he discovered the person actually was a bit of a jerk. And he decided, look, I just don't want to write this anymore. Now, I have great pleasure in telling you that after writing this biography, my admiration for Lewis increased even more. And I hope you'll enjoy reading this biography, but really the thing I hope the biography will do is to make you to want to read Lewis himself. There is richness there. And if I help you find it, I will be delighted. But the important thing really is, this biography is to try and help you to engage more with Lewis, to get more out of your reading of him, and thus to enjoy Lewis at least as much as I did. Thank you so much for listening.
Fantastic. Let's have a seat here.
You like it?
You can sit with your water.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I've been given an opportunity to ask a few questions on behalf of all of you. I don't know what your questions are, so I'm asking my own. Maybe some of you thought of these same questions. Professor McGrath, you've told me and a number of people that your favorite Lewis Narnia book is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Why?
Mr. Lanier, that's a very good question. I think the thing I love about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is how Lewis introduces Narnia so gently, so slowly. It's like drawing aside a curtain very, very slowly. And you begin to realize that there's hidden depth, there's something more to what is seen. I also very much like the way in which the story opens. It's very easy to imagine this situation, children looking for excitement, and then discovering this mysterious world which raises questions and then answers questions. So I just find it a wonderfully written book which raises some very good questions, but also, I think, gives us some very good answers.
Okay, you urged people in your conclusion to go ahead and engage Lewis, start reading Lewis. Let's say you're in midlife and you've never really read C.S. Lewis before. Where would you recommend someone start?
I would recommend that you read Mere Christianity. It is one of his best books. Its language still speaks to us. And I would suggest to you that you read it through, and where you find bits that intrigue you, you read it slowly. For example, the chapter on hope is beautifully written, and I will take a class through that and take an hour to do so. Lewis is, I think, very often best read in company. So you can pick away at a text and find hidden things that really are there, but you as an individual have missed, but the group actually has found.
I'm curious what you saw in C.S. Lewis's wit. And one of the things that came to mind, one of my favorite lines, and I'm sure I don't have it quoted precisely, but in one of the books, Lewis said, there once was a boy named Clarence Eustace Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. What did you see in his? Was he a funny man? Did he have? Talk to us about that, please.
Lewis was a very elegant writer, but he also was a man who laughed a lot. All the memories people have of him, particularly when he moved to Cambridge, was of a very jovial, very boisterous person who was full of fun. And I see that echoed in his books. There are times when he is very serious. There are also times when he's lighthearted, when he engages you, and you just wish you'd been there because you sense that this was a joyful, happy occasion, and it would have been great to have been a fly on the wall, for example, at a meeting of the Inklings.
Okay, hard question. One I should have warned you I was going to ask, but it didn't occur to me till just now. That someone out there must have sent it up here. If C.S. Lewis, through some Lazarus miracle, was here for a moment, and you had a chance to ask him one question or engage him on one subject, having done all of this work, what would you want to know? What would you engage him in?
I think there are so many questions I'd love to ask him. Because, I mean, when you write a biography, you come up with all these questions, and you know Lewis could answer them, but at the moment that is just not possible. And I suspect in heaven there's going to be a very long queue, very long line, people queuing up saying, Lewis, what did you mean by this? But I think the one thing that really stands out for me as being important simply is this. I would want to ask him which of his works he thinks we ought to be reading. Because, I personally come away from him often wondering how he evaluated his own works. Happily, I like so many of them, it's not a problem, but I'd still love to know the answer.
When you were in Wheaton, and Professor's been up there dealing with his book publisher. By the way, the book that's out is just out. I mean, it's just been published in the last couple of weeks. This is a brand new book. But I had a chance to go into there's a Wade Center where you did a lot of research. And I had a chance to see a number of books that were actually from Lewis's own personal collection, including one where he had written in the back of the book, "Never again," because he's not going to read it ever again. He didn't like it. Did you come across any notes like that just...
Yes, I did. The Wade collection has a very large number of books from Lewis's own library. And I chose a representative selection of about 20, which I was going to look at. And one of them was one of those, never again. In other words, I've read this, that's done. One of them was an Icelandic grammar, in which Lewis had made some rather obscure comments about past tenses in Icelandic. But what I found really helpful was books I knew he'd been writing at the time he was reading, at the time he was writing other things, where very often he had underlined, put NB and so on. And at several points I could see how what he was reading fed into the book he was writing. I was very happy about that.
Okay, so there are these books, and they're in the basement of the Wade Center under lock and key that have Lewis's notes. And it made me think when I saw those, if I had Alister McGrath's library, would I find notes like that in the margins of the books you read?
You would find annotations, you'd find underlinings, but unfortunately, Lewis wrote notes in the books. I write notes on pieces of paper. So unfortunately, all you would see is a series of damaged books without any real indication of what I'd found in them.
Okay, which brings up the next question that I had, and that was, as you were reading through this wealth of material, did you keep notes in a book? Did you keep notes on a legal pad? Did you do it on a computer? How did you keep up with 15 months of reading tens of thousands of pages?
I took notes, I wrote down phrases, I wrote down my observations, and I wrote very often, must come back to this. So in effect, it was almost like a running commentary on what I was reading and a reminder to myself that there were certain things that weren't quite clear, I'd have to come back to them, including a lot of notes like that from 1929 and 1930.
Interesting. Now, you taught at Oxford for
25 years.
25 years. And I'm sure you went to the same pub where Lewis would hang out, and I'm sure did you know people in your past that knew Lewis, just in the process? And I don't know that you would have consulted him for the book, but what kind of reputation has Lewis maintained at Oxford since he left?
Lewis is regarded as a very able literary scholar. And Lewis is, I think, increasingly being seen at Oxford as one of the most significant intellectuals of the last century. Did I talk to people at Oxford? I talked to one in the year 1978 when I was just beginning to study theology, and one of my tutors was a man called Peter Bide. Peter Bide was the man who married Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis in hospital. And the reason I discovered this story was we were looking at his bookshelf. He said, come and look at my bookshelf, see if there's anything you like. And I saw a book by C.S. Lewis. I said, oh, you've got one of C.S. Lewis's books, because I enjoyed reading C.S. Lewis. And he said to me, there's a story behind that. And he told me the story of how he unexpectedly, because he wasn't expecting to do this, ended up marrying Davidman and Lewis at hospital. And I remembered that story, and happily, Bide wrote it down before he died, so it's confirmed somewhere else. But that just made me think, there are a lot of stories about Lewis. I wish I knew more of them. And I think I've been able to add a little bit to those in the biography.
Now, as I understand it, you've graciously allowed, recognizing after coming from England, Chicago to here, you've still got to get to Houston tonight so we can use you tomorrow. But you've agreed to stay around and sign some copies of your book, and we want to get to that real quickly here. I think it's right out that way. But before we do, 2 last questions. Who do you read for your, you've got to do pleasure reading somewhere, don't you? Who do you read?
I find I read novels that don't require an enormous amount of intellectual concentration. But
So Alister McGrath has Dune Buggy Baby on his shelf?
No, you mustn't laugh about this, but you asked the question.
Yes.
I will read crime fiction, and I love Perry Mason. And I love the courtroom scenes. I think that may have helped me like Lewis, because for Perry Mason, the crossroom examination is about clues that point to the truth. Even so, it's lightweight stuff, and it's great fun to read.
Yes, all that lawyer stuff's lightweight. Last question. What's your next project you'll tell us about so we can start working on you to come back?
Well, I will tell you, I had intended to move on beyond Lewis. However, I enjoyed doing it so much, and I kept thinking to myself, Lewis is a great traveling companion for faith. And so what I'm doing is writing another book for Tyndall House, who published the biography. And it's basically, supposing you were thinking about suffering, supposing you were thinking about making sense of the world, suppose you were thinking about trying to work out what to do with your life. How might C.S. Lewis help you do that? In other words, not getting him to tell you, but drawing on some ideas from his works to give you a sense, look, engaging with this guy might help me think these things through. So it's really almost saying it's about journeying with C.S. Lewis and seeing how he might illuminate or help things as you journey. And what we're going to do is do it biographically. The big questions that bothered Lewis as a young man, the questions that bothered Lewis midlife, the questions that bothered him in the final months of his life. So in effect, it's big questions, big periods of life. And I think it might work, but it just seems a very good way of making further use of everything I've gleaned about C.S. Lewis in the last 5 years.
And this is due out when?
Hopefully, this time next year.
Fantastic. Dean Long, will you tell us where he's going to be signing books? And I'll start escorting him before the masses leave.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful evening.
Fantastic.
Let's take this off.
President Perrin is sorry that he is unable to be here with us this evening. He is out of the country, but sends his well wishes. We pray that his return, God will bless his return. He's returning to Lubbock on Sunday. Following a benediction, we will be dismissed. You are all invited to a dessert reception in the Baker Conference Center, which is just across the mall. Professor McGrath will answer questions, and he will sign copies of his books, which are on sale, including C.S. Lewis, Alive, Eccentric Genius, Reluctant Prophet. But before our prayer, a couple of announcements. Some of you know that this is C.S. Lewis weekend at LCU. Tomorrow morning, the Quaker Avenue Church of Christ is sponsoring the program Faith Inside the Wardrobe, the Impact of C.S. Lewis on Christian Thought. This is tomorrow morning from 9 to 1 o'clock with Tom Williams, independent Lewis scholar, and Kenneth Hawley, associate professor of English at LCU. And then tomorrow evening, there's a production of the play Shadowlands by the LCU Drama Area, directed by Laurie Doyle. That's tomorrow evening at 7:30 in the CDC Theater. Tickets are $10, and you can purchase tickets at the door. Now, Dr. Jeff Carey Associate Professor of Theology in the LCU Department of Biblical Studies, will lead us in a prayer of blessing.
Let's close this great evening in prayer. Our God, we receive this event as a gift from you. And we thank you for helping us to hear the gospel tonight. We're thankful for the way that Jesus' life is reflected through humans, and how that life was reflected to us through C.S. Lewis, and how it's been reflected yet again through Professor McGrath's reflections on Lewis, and may that reflection continue in us so that all the world may behold the risen Lord Jesus Christ. And now we go to love and serve the world, and may those to whom love is a stranger find among us generous friends. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. You're dismissed.